Our topic will be how to identify socio-political and economic priorities to address the challenges of inequalities in the perspective of the COVID-19 pandemic. You will listen to various keynote addresses, which will be followed by a panel discussion with insightful guest speakers. And the audience is very much encouraged to ask questions via the live feed through Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter channels. Without any further ado, I would like now to give the floor to the President of Socialists and Democrats Group, Ms. Irache Garcia Perez, for her opening speech. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. We need to strengthen our European ties with Africa. We do this to face the current crisis and also to promote economic development in the two continents that must be sustainable, fair, and make use of the new digital technologies. Last March, the European Commission put forward a new strategy with Africa. Now, we must come up with concrete initiatives. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the summit between the African Union and the European Union planned for the end of October have to be postponed. Therefore, even more than expected, the S&D Group Africa Week represents an excellent opportunity to reflect upon our common goals and objectives for the next decade. The 21st century should be a century of Africa. It is a continent with a great potential, and I am not only speaking about natural resources, but most of all about its people. While Europe is aging, Africa is mainly a very young continent. Today, its population is nearly 1.3 billion, and according to the United Nations, it will reach 2.5 billion in 2050 and more than 4 billion by the end of the century. We are neighbors and also natural partners. As a Spaniard, I am very well aware of how close we are in many respects. We need to strengthen the cooperation at the European level, going beyond bilateral agreements. Also, the COVID pandemic marks a turning point for our cooperation. Africa seems to be less affected in terms of death by the pandemic. The WHO says 26,000 deaths in early October compared to 230,000 in Europe. However, we have all been hit by the global economic consequences of the lockdowns and the reduction of economic activity as well as tourism. Like us, Africa has been hit hard by the economic and social consequences of the crisis. It faces the effects of sanitary restrictions on the local economy, especially on agriculture, the drop in exports of raw materials, and major part of its economy, the collapse of international tourism and the decline in transfer for emigrants due to the difficulties encountered in the developed countries. Africa faces all of this at the same time. The International Monetary Fund forecast that the economy will contract by 3.2% in Sub-Saharan Africa in 2020, representing the worst recession in a quarter of a century. The economic downturn has had a strong impact on other challenges. According to the World Food Programme, 270 million people are now at risk of famine due to the pandemic, mainly in Africa. In addition to the pandemic, the locust plague in Eastern Africa and the effects of climate change will cause the worst humanitarian crisis since the Second World War. We cannot allow the COVID-19 pandemic to become a pandemic of hunger. For this reason, the capacity of the European Union to support Africa, despite our own difficulties, will be essential for the future of our relationship. With the program Team Europe, the Union and its member states have already mobilized around 8 billion euros in Africa. In particular, 5.5 billion went to sub-Saharan Africa. The financial support was mainly assigned to protective equipment and health centers. In the face of COVID-19, long-term solutions can only come from a vaccine. The vaccine raised risk, increasing both inequalities among countries and geopolitical tension. By participating in the COVAX facility together with the World Health Organization, we are campaigning for a multilateral solution to facilitate access to the vaccine for all, and in particular to benefit low and middle-income countries. We are also taking the global lead in the relief and cancellation of the external debt of the most indebted countries. The European Union and its member states have actively supported the suspension of debt payments at the G20 and the Paris Club. We will continue to work toward extending this suspension beyond 2020. However, it is not enough. Many countries continue to pay more for their external debt than for the health of their citizens. That is why we believe it is necessary to restructure the external debt. These actions are essential in the short term, but the future of the continent also depends on the Africa's ability to strengthen their institutions and cope with the arrival of 30 million young people on the labor market every year. We cannot afford to work together with our African partners so that the economic recovery can be sustainable in both Africa and Europe, making good use of our natural resources and benefiting the working people, not only big companies. We need fair economic growth that will contribute to human development. Together, we must try to stop global warming, cooperating with the multilateral institution. If we do not take timely actions, water scarcity and desertification will produce new conflicts, and people will be forced to leave their homes. This is a threat we can already see in the south of Europe. At the same time, the transition to a circular and low-carbon economy will be essential to combat the ecological crisis that is threatening humanity today. Africa has a strong potential in terms of sustainable agriculture, solar energy, biomass, and hydroelectricity. We should all make the most of these new technologies. Africa has already made huge progress in recent years. The use of mobile payment system has allowed an important part of the population, including young and women, to overcome the difficulties of access to traditional banking service. The setup of African companies, especially in this sector, must contribute to the economic growth of the continent. Finally, we also propose to strengthen our ties in the field of culture and education to guarantee a better and mutual understanding. But above all, we must listen to what you, African leaders and African citizens, have to say. It must to be a two-way conversation that is a real partnership. I also hope to hear many women's voices in this conversation, because we cannot leave every important decision to half of the population. Women, please have your say. Every voice deserves to be heard. Just like the European Union is made up of 27 member states, and we try to be united in diversity, so is Africa, even more diverse, with 54 countries, with a different history, a rich culture, with many languages, tradition, and specific challenges. So only by an honest exchange based on trust can we develop a true partnership in which both can grow and work together for a better world. That is what all of us here want to achieve. And I sincerely hope that this Africa Week will make a major contribution to the next EU-Africa Summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Perez, for introducing us to the topic. Now, I have the honor and delight today to present our first keynote speaker in the form of an exclusive interview. He's a human rights activist whose commitment to human dignity, women's rights, and respect for the physical integrity of women's body has led to death threats on his life. His colleagues and him at the Panzi Hospital give medical attention and psychological support to women and girls who have been main victims of a brutal campaign of mass sexual violence by armed rebel groups in the DRC. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to present the exclusive interview conducted by journalists for Euronews, Isabel da Silva, with world-renowned gynecologist, human rights activist, winner of the Sakharov Prize in 2014 and the Nobel Peace Laureate Prize in 2018, Mr. Dr. Denis Mukwege. Let's watch the interview.
Merci, Dr Mukwege, de nous rejoindre depuis Bukavu, capitale de la province du Sud Kivu, en RDC. Quel a été l'impact de la pandémie du Covid-19 sur le travail de l'hôpital et de la Fondation Panzi pour fournir des services médicaux et sociaux aux femmes victimes des violences sexuelles?
L'hôpital ne donne pas seulement les traitements médicaux aux victimes de violences sexuelles, mais une prise en charge que nous appelons une prise en charge holistique, donc qui comprend 4 piliers: un pilier médical, un pilier psychologique, un pilier légal et un pilier socio-économique. Et c'est ces piliers qui ont beaucoup souffert pendant la pandémie de Covid-19, puisqu'il y a eu un ralentissement des activités économiques. Alors toutes ces femmes qui vivaient avec un petit capital dans leurs activités génératrices de revenus, aujourd'hui, on les voit revenir pour nous demander un nouveau soutien pour pouvoir redémarrer leurs affaires. Quand les femmes ne s'autosuffisent pas économiquement, quand elles sont très pauvres, elles deviennent également vulnérables par rapport aux violences sexuelles.
Alors, comme il y a moins de mobilité à cause de la pandémie, vous avez remarqué des changements en termes de cas qui arrivent à l'hôpital?
Nous avons observé à l'hôpital plutôt une augmentation de viols d'enfants. Et ça, peut-être, nous pouvons expliquer par le fait que les enfants, pour le moment, quand ils ne vont pas à l'école et que les parents, peut-être, s'occupent plutôt à pouvoir trouver comment les soigner, les nourrir, et que les enfants soient abandonnés à eux-mêmes, ils sont exposés à plus de viols. Et là, c'est vrai que le nombre d'enfants traités pendant cette période de pandémie était plus important que d'habitude.
Vous travaillez contre l'impunité des crimes de viol comme arme de guerre. Pourquoi préconisez-vous la création d'un tribunal international?
Il y a eu des viols de centaines de femmes qui étaient violées dans une seule nuit. C'était des viols systématiques. On a vu aussi bien des enfants, des bébés, des vieillards, même des hommes qui ont été violés. Et aujourd'hui, les auteurs de ces crimes sont connus et ils sont impunis. Ces auteurs sont aussi bien nationaux qu'étrangers, puisque jusqu'à l'heure où je vous parle, il y a des groupes armés étrangers qui continuent à commettre des crimes en République démocratique du Congo. Aujourd'hui, on a tout essayé. On a essayé les armes, on a essayé les négociations, on a essayé les accords de paix, mais tout ça, ça n'a pas marché. Et je crois que le seul élément qu'on n'a pas utilisé, c'est la justice. Un tribunal pénal international pour le Congo peut s'occuper peut-être de gros poissons, Mais il faut aussi avoir des chambres spécialisées mixtes qui, à travers la République. Et l'objectif pour nous, c'est que non seulement la population a besoin de connaître la vérité et être à mesure de pouvoir dire plus jamais ça.
Et comment fonctionne le Global Survivors Fund que vous avez créé il y a un an pour financer des projets de réparation pour les survivants des violences sexuelles?
Pour la prise en charge des victimes de violences sexuelles, surtout sur le plan médical et psychosocial, nous avons un soutien continu de l'Union européenne. Et l'objectif de ces fonds globaux, c'est de pouvoir donc soutenir le projet de réparation dans des pays, puisque nous considérons que si les femmes ont le courage d'aller en justice, de pouvoir porter plainte, il ne faudrait pas qu'elles soient après découragées, puisque après il n'y a aucune réparation qui est faite. Et je pense que lorsque les femmes ont déjà le courage de surmonter leurs souffrances et de porter plainte, il est de notre devoir, il est du devoir de l'humanité de pouvoir en fait les aider à aller jusqu'au bout. Et je pense qu'aller jusqu'au bout, c'est les aider à guérir. Et cette guérison ne peut pas se faire sans justice, sans réparation.
L'Union européenne et l'Union africaine entendent lancer un nouveau partenariat en 2021. Quelles devraient être les priorités d'action dans les pays les plus touchés par les conflits et crises humanitaires comme le Congo?
La coopération au développement pour des questions d'intérêt politique commun entre l'Europe et l'Afrique, une coopération plus large et œuvrant pour les questions migratoires, le changement climatique, la paix et la sécurité, ce sont des objectifs nobles. Et là, je crois que le plus grand problème aujourd'hui, c'est la mise en œuvre, la stratégie des mises en œuvre qui souffrent. Lorsqu'on ne travaille pas pour la paix et la sécurité en Afrique, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Les jeunes n'ont plus d'espoir, les jeunes ont tendance plutôt à prendre les chemins de la migration, avec toutes les conséquences. Les conséquences en Afrique, il y a une perte donc des cerveaux qui est très très importante, mais également au niveau de l'Europe, on voit très bien que les migrations entraînent plutôt une montée des extrémistes, ce qui n'est pas une bonne chose. Mais entre les deux, il y a tout ce qui se passe dans la mer Méditerranée où plusieurs dizaines de jeunes Africains périssent, ce qui ne fait pas vraiment la fierté de notre humanité.
Les gens vous appellent Docteur Miracle, mais vous continuez à recevoir des menaces à cause de votre travail. Quel est votre quotidien aujourd'hui?
Nous espérons pouvoir continuer à faire notre travail, accompagner les femmes, mais le futur, nous le voyons beaucoup plus sans ces viols. Et pour nous, mettre fin à ces violences que subissent les femmes serait le sommet de notre travail, puisque c'est là que nous aspirons de voir un jour les femmes congolaises être à mesure d'aller cultiver, d'aller chercher l'eau ou le bois de chauffe et revenir sans avoir peur d'être violées.
Merci beaucoup, Dr Mukwege, pour votre participation dans The Global Conversation.
Welcome back. That was an interview, an exclusive interview between journalist Isabel da Silva and Dr. Dennis Mukwege. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a very insightful one. We would have loved to have Dr. Dennis Mukwege with us in the studio today, but given the world situation due to the pandemic, he could not make it here. But we hope you enjoyed the interview. Coming up, it's time now for me to announce our second keynote speaker. From 2004 until 2007, he was the president of the European Parliament, and in 2018, he became the Minister of Foreign Affairs to the European Union and Cooperation in Spain. He is the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and the Commission Vice President in charge of coordinating the external action of the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, Please welcome His Excellency Joseph Borrell.
Hello. Do you see me? No.
No.
And now? Now?
Yes.
Okay.
Welcome, Your
Perfect.
Excellency.
You know, I am at home, confined due to the coronavirus, but I am going to use this opportunity to say everybody that I am okay, that I was negative coming back from Africa. I spent some days in Ethiopia, but one of the members of my team was positive. So although I was negative, I decided to spend some days in quarantine until the second test. But I use this opportunity to tell everybody that don't worry for me. I am very well, no symptoms, and negative, but it shows that the coronavirus is still around us. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to the group of Socialists and Democrats for organizing this Africa Week. It's the fourth time. I think it's very timely because Africa is very high in our agenda, and it brings us together, even in COVID times. And I'm always full of very interesting speakers and cultural events. This meeting is a very, very important one for Africa and for the European Union relationship with Africa. Do you see me well? Is the screen okay?
Yes.
It's okay, no? Well, I was saying that I am very honored to share this high-level session with the Sakharov Prize and Nobel Prize laureate, Dr. Mukwege. His efforts to end the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war on armed conflicts, his dedication for victims of sexual violence, and his fight against impunity for such crimes are very much inspiring for all of us. Time is limited, I know. Sorry for spending time talking about myself. So let me concentrate on a few key messages as High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, who is working hard together with my fellow commissioners, Urpilainen and Lenarčič, to prepare the next European African Summit, which has been delayed due to coronavirus. But we expect to have a lot of deliverables to concrete our partnership with Africa. This is, for me, the relationship between European Union and Africa, one of the rare cases where the word strategic that we use a lot is justified. The future of our partnership matters and is something that we can really shape together through common choices. It's over the time when we said we have a strategy for Africa. Now we have to say we share a common strategy, the Europeans and the Africans, all together. Where people go is a reflection of their priorities. Just to say that this year I have already been twice in the African continent, in spite of the coronavirus and all the restrictions. And I'm intending to go back next month to the North of Africa countries and to the Sahelian countries, which are, as you know, in quite an important trouble. When I'm back from a 3-day visit to the African Union in Ethiopia, together with my colleague Lenarčič, we were there with a humanitarian air bridge flight. And last week we handed over a third and last batch of 1.4 million COVID test kits to the African Center for Disease Control. It was a concrete and visible example of European solidarity in our joint fight against this common enemy. In total, over 8 billion has been mobilized for sub-Saharan Africa by the European Union and its member states through our Team Europe approach, putting together the European Union institutions and the member states. 2 euro billions. Well, it's not enough, I know very much that it's far away from what is needed, but it has been a big effort for us just at the moment where we are reaching the last months or weeks of our financial perspective and the drawers are empty. So let's hope that the next financial perspective will give more resources and capabilities to continue engaging with Africa. This is just the beginning of a long road. Unfortunately, the economics fallout will go so huge that we will need much more. I am very much worried by the economic consequences of the pandemic in Africa and in Europe. But in Africa, the economic consequences will be bigger than the health consequences themselves. The constraints to mobility, the limitations to economic activity, the difficulties of the transportation of goods will unhappily produce more suffering and more dead people than the disease itself. And the economic consequences of the pandemic will be lasting. So we have to reinforce our capacity of working together to overcome this crisis. To start with, we have to talk about debt relief and not just about freezing of debt payments. We have to go further, and it has to be agreed. This will require international mobilization, including China, to play a full role at the level of the international community. In Africa, we have the paradox that the 6 of the 10 more quickly growing countries, more dynamic economies, 6 out of 10 are African economies. But at the same time, 36 most weakened countries in the world are also in Africa. So it's a very heterogeneous continent. And all of them will be affected, but for most, if we don't give a debt relief, as I said, much more than just freezing payments, we're going to go into a crisis of external debt. And this we cannot afford. So that's what we are calling from the European Union for our international efforts for debt relief for the most vulnerable countries. But we also have to look after the pandemics. One day or another, the pandemic will be over. All pandemics in the humankind story. I was in Addis and I had a long discussion with our partners on how we can step our partnership, making it more ambitious and more political, more geared towards the future. Africa is a young and dynamic continent. We look at Africa most of the time with the lenses of migration, and we look at that as a danger. But Africa is much more than migrants towards Europe. In fact, the most important part of migration takes place inside the African countries themselves. Migration is inter-African dynamic. And we have to help some of the countries who receive the most important part of this migration to be able to cope with it. I noticed that things are changing in Africa. People are much better, much self-confident. They believe more in their future. The young people are much better prepared. And if we want to work together with Africa to promote growth on both continents, this growth has to be more green, more digital, and mainly more equal. I know that when you talk about green and digital, you talk about green and digital in a refugees camp in the Somalian border. It's a little bit strange because for these people, green and digital doesn't mean the same thing as for us. But it's not a luxury. It's not a top-up coming from the Western world. We need to make Africa engage on the new wave of economic development, leaping forward and maybe jumping one of the stages of development that you don't know to go step by step on the same way that we did. You can leap forward and to go directly to the next dynamics that digital revolution is going to create. And also to take into account the big potential of Africa on renewables, hydrogen, solar, wind, hydro. Africa has everything in order to engage with the green revolution. And also the enterprises. The role of young people and women is going to be very important. And Africa is a young continent. It has one of the rare resources in the world, young people. Here in Europe, young people is a rare resource because we don't reproduce ourselves. And we need migration also, in spite of everything. We need to accept in our social fabric people coming from Africa and the products that people are producing in Africa. We cannot refuse at both at the same time people and the products they produce, one thing or another. This is the complementarity we have to look for. In the field of digital, it's funny to see that Africa has a number of very exciting entrepreneurs. Also on green technologies, there are enormous opportunities, as I said, in solar, biomass, hydroelectricity. Just imagine the rivers in Africa, the incredible potential they have. And we have to support this initiative and bring them to scale. Have to explain that the European Union Green Deal we are promoting worldwide is not a hidden form of protectionism. Sometimes it can be perceived as this. No, come on, you say about green, but in fact, what do you want to have a barrier to our products? No, it's not about this. It should be perceived as a new model of economic growth, more sustainable, designed to turn climate and environmental challenges into opportunities, trying to do it in a just and inclusive way. Our wider goal is to support Africa to avoid some of our past mistakes. We did a lot. And we cannot afford that the African development is just a repetition, step by step, of the same path that we have followed. No. Fighting poverty, including improving the quality of life, and while protecting the planet. This is the real challenge. Allow me to make a couple of last final points. First, in the world at large, there is a battle of narrative and socioeconomic systems fighting each other to show to the people who is the most performant, who is the best one, in order to be able to face the challenges of the 21st century. And a big strategic question is, what future model of society will Africa choose? One based on sustainable development, solidarity and human rights, or a different, more authoritarian models? And about it, there is a big battle of narrative, trying to present each of these rival systems as the best one and look at the results in the fighting against pandemia, each one will claim. And second, multilateralism is in crisis, and we see growing trend of countries playing power politics. Because the alternative to multilateralism is just the rule of the stronger. Power politics. I am the stronger, I impose my rule. And Africans and Europeans, we have a massive shared interest in protecting the rules-based international order. I know this is not a very sexy expression, rules-based international order. America first, or give me back control, looks better, looks more moving to the people. But there are bad messages. Rules-based international order, and avoid the drift into might makes right. The power makes the law. I am powerful, I impose my view of the world. Europe and Africa make up more than 40% of the United Nations membership, more than 40% altogether. So our collective weight is real and can change the course of action at the global level. This is the thought I would like to share with you. Thank you very much for your time, for your attention. It has been an honor to join this discussion. Congratulations once again for this initiative, and best wishes for the rest of this Socialist and Democrat African Week. And believe me, this year, this coming year, should be the African year for the European Union. The virus has delayed. It was supposed to be the 2020. It will be the 2021. And we have to engage more with African people, civil society, ONGs, not only governments, with the rich and dynamic society that Africa presents to the world. Not being afraid of what some people call the demographic bomb of Africa. It's a source of opportunities for all of us. And this has to be done through a shared partnership. This is part of my job. I will do my best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Excellency Joseph Borrell. Thank you for such an inspiring keynote address. Before we continue the program, I would like now to thank Ms. Perez for making time to be with us this afternoon. As I understood, you have to attend other also important matters. Thank you very much for introducing the topic of this afternoon, and it was great having you. Thank you.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you. We are continuing our discussion on fighting inequalities. Many international organizations highlight that inequality is on the rise worldwide. The COVID-19 pandemic has worsened this dangerous trend as it deeply impacted the most vulnerable groups. Workers in the informal sector, young people, women, and others have found their livelihoods threatened. There is an urgent need to identify political priorities and solutions in this worsening situation. Fortunately, we are very happy that we have invited an excellent panel of guest speakers to start a conversation about these problems. Let me start by introducing our first guest speaker, Mr. Trevor Saruwaka, a member of the Parliament of Zimbabwe who is joining us online. Mr. Saruwaka, what is your assessment of the world we live in now and the consequences of rising inequality in society? We can't hear you yet.
Hello, can you hear?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. No, thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Honorable.
Good afternoon. How are you?
Fine, thank you. And yourself?
I'm all right. Can
Great.
you come again with your question?
What is your assessment of the world we live in now and the consequences of rising inequality in society?
Thank you. It's very unfortunate that we are living in a world where we have failed over time to bridge the gap between the poor and the rich. The divide is going bigger and wider. So there is a very big risk as we move forward that insecurity is going to increase, as was experienced during the COVID problems. The impact on the lower side of the demographics was terrible. We have got people who were affected because they are staying in slums. They don't have any livelihoods. So we've got a very major problem, inequality, but we must deal with it because that's the way we can rescue this mankind.
Thank you, Mrs. Sarawaka. You are staying with us for the Q&A session as well, and we also have respondents, youth representative, who are going to ask some questions later on. Our next guest speaker is Ms. Nathalie Yam. She's in Leader Party in Ivory Coast. Good afternoon, Ms. Yam. Welcome. We can't hear you.
Oh.
Bonjour.
Le son a été rétabli.
Bonjour, Madame Yam.
Bonjour.
Bienvenue. Bienvenue. Selon vous, Madame Yam, quelles sont les priorités politiques qui doivent être suivies afin de lutter de manière effective contre les inégalités?
Oui, oups, pardon. Bonjour et merci pour la question et merci de m'avoir conviée aujourd'hui à donner mon point de vue, celui de mon parti leader, qui est membre de l'Alliance progressiste que je représente ici, pour discuter de l'identification des priorités pour contrer les inégalités dans le contexte de la COVID-19. Alors, avant l'arrivée de la pandémie, avant mars 2020, les inégalités existaient déjà en Afrique. Et les priorités des gouvernements africains à ce moment-là étaient, premièrement, l'émergence des économies. C'est un mot que les chefs d'État africains, comme les gourous d'une secte, martelaient aux populations de Abidjan à Lomé, de Dakar à Yaoundé, de N'Djamena à Libreville. Deuxièmement, l'investissement dans les infrastructures physiques pour prétendre avoir concrétisé cette fameuse émergence par la construction de routes, de ponts, de palais, d'aéroports. Et enfin, la troisième priorité, c'était la course à l'endettement pour financer tout cela avec la corruption et le détournement qui l'accompagnent. Alors, très ironiquement, lorsque Covid se déclenche, c'est exactement toutes ces infrastructures de circulation qui ont été fermées et celles qu'on aurait dû ouvrir, à savoir les hôpitaux, les laboratoires, les industries, les écoles, eh bien celles-là, elles n'existaient pas. L'arrivée de la pandémie a donc prouvé l'inadéquation des priorités, a mis à nu le bilan catastrophique des gouvernements africains et a accru les inégalités devant l'accès à la santé, au savoir, au travail, à la technologie et au capital. En Europe, pour contrer les retombées négatives du confinement que vous avez imposé à vos populations, vous avez opté pour des mesures d'accompagnement économique, pour le télétravail, pour l'enseignement à distance. Chez nous, rien de tout cela, car non seulement tout ce qui concerne le capital humain a été négligé, mais nos chefs d'État ont privilégié l'instauration de couvre-feu, le passage à tabac des récalcitrants, le détournement des fonds dédiés à la lutte contre la pandémie et la précarisation de populations contraintes à survivre au jour le jour grâce à l'informel, en l'absence de connaissances, en l'absence d'emploi, d'industrialisation et aussi de digitalisation. Jusqu'ici, malheureusement, l'Union européenne assiste avec beaucoup de célérité non seulement nos gouvernants dans ce comportement inique, mais elle participe elle-même à creuser ces inégalités. Je vous en donne un exemple. Au prétexte de la Covid, l'Union européenne a fermé ses frontières aux citoyens lambdas africains, mais par contre, vous autorisez les évacuations sanitaires des privilégiés, des gouvernants, alors que le bas peuple est obligé de se débrouiller à survivre dans des systèmes sanitaires délabrés, des hôpitaux mouroirs, ce dont vous êtes très conscient, puisque c'est cet état de choses qui vous a fait prédire une hécatombe en Afrique face au coronavirus, chose qui, grâce au ciel, n'a pas eu lieu, eu égard à la résistance inexpliquée des Africains. Les populations n'ont pas été décimées par le virus, qui peut-être n'aime pas la pauvreté, mais elles meurent de faim et de maladies chroniques. Les gouvernements qui n'ont pas été capables d'avoir des réponses judicieuses se sont obligés de modifier les règles du jeu pour s'accrocher au pouvoir en changeant les constitutions, en les violant, en réprimant, en violentant et en tuant. Dans quelques semaines, il y a des élections au Burkina Faso, en Centrafrique, en Côte d'Ivoire, au Ghana, en Guinée, au Niger et en Tanzanie. Mais dans un contexte de crise préélectorale, on compte déjà 60 morts en Guinée, 30 morts et de nombreux blessés en Côte d'Ivoire, où Alassane Dramane Ouattara fait arrêter les membres de la société civile qui refusent son troisième mandat illégal. Il fait embastiller des femmes politiques et des députés et exiler et expulser ses opposants. Et vous, à l'Union européenne, vous êtes d'accord avec ça. Vous financez cela. Vos représentants chez nous sont des accompagnateurs zélés des gouvernements au lieu d'être aux côtés des populations comme vous le faites si bien en Biélorussie, par exemple. En Côte d'Ivoire, Jobst von Kirchmann utilise le budget que vous mettez à sa disposition pour danser sur des estrades et organiser des concerts de musique avec les alliés au pouvoir comme réponse aux revendications du peuple pour un report du scrutin présidentiel afin de mettre en place un cadre électoral inclusif, crédible, transparent, juste et apaisé. Vous dépensez 4,5 millions d'euros du contribuable européen pour financer un processus électoral que le peuple ivoirien refuse, comme vous financez les camps de répression de migrants en Libye et dans le Sahel pour éviter de voir arriver chez vous ceux qui fuient la misère que vous entretenez chez eux ou bien qui veulent tout simplement s'ouvrir au monde. Les peuples africains veulent des fondations démocratiques aussi solides que celles que vous avez construites en Europe. Et vous nous distribuez du riz et du savon en nous demandant de rester calmes, passifs et dociles face aux abus des gouvernements. Pour conclure, je voudrais quand même que vous sachiez que la jeunesse d'Afrique n'acceptera plus l'injustice qui lui est imposée. Elle vous observe et elle s'interroge sur les doubles standards que l'Union européenne applique. Sont-ils motivés par des raisons idéologiques? Sont-ils continentaux? Sont-ils liés à la couleur de peau ou bien aux amitiés entre ceux qui gouvernent ici et là-bas? La démocratie, la liberté, les droits humains, le respect de la parole donnée sont considérés comme des valeurs universelles par les nouvelles générations africaines. Mais quand nous voyons l'UE en faire la promotion en Europe et ailleurs dans le monde, mais fermer les yeux et la bouche quand elles sont violées en Afrique, juste pour sécuriser de juteux contrats pour ces entreprises et pour ces États, nous ne pouvons pas ne pas en tirer de conséquences le moment venu. Je vous remercie d'avoir donné l'occasion à une femme africaine, citoyenne africaine, politique africaine, de s'exprimer ici dans ce panel.
Je vous remercie, Madame Yam, pour cette intervention très riche. Je suis sûre, une intervention qui, n'est-ce pas, va susciter aussi, à poser plusieurs questions par la suite. Vous restez avec nous pour la session questions-réponses tout à l'heure. Je voudrais aussi vous signaler qu'il y a 3 représentants de jeunes qui donc, ont préparé des questions qui seront adressées à vous, membres du panel. I'm going to switch back to English to introduce our third guest speaker of this panel, Mr. Bert Koenders. Mr. Bert Koenders is the Special Envoy of the World Bank for Fragile States and former Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Koenders, good afternoon and welcome.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Koenders, in what ways do you feel that inequalities impact peace and security?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me for this panel in my own political family. I'm very happy that Europe and the Social Democrats put Africa in the front of the agenda this week. And I've listened to all the colleagues here. I think I'm inspired most by the words of Joseph Borrell saying we need a real strategic partnership with Africa. Not just because we see it as an opportunity or a risk or a threat or talking only about migration and terror, but really because we live in a geopolitically difficult world. And I am deeply convinced also after my work for the United Nations in Africa that we have a lot of opportunities together, both in terms of our self-enlightened interest, as well as now in the context of the COVID virus. Let me answer your question quite directly, because I am very concerned about what we see right now in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. I say that on personal note, but of course I have worked also as special envoy now for the World Bank in the most fragile countries. And it has to be said that the figures are pretty dismal when it comes to poverty and inequality. As we see in our world in Europe, the fault lines between the rich and the poor getting bigger because of COVID. COVID is non-discriminatory, but in the end, those who are most vulnerable in the job market or in terms of age and in terms of other groups, we have an opportunity in Europe for counter-cyclical policies. We can put our government budgets forward. We can borrow on the international markets. And at the moment that in many parts of Africa, actually, we saw a surge of economic opportunities and growth. This is going to be a major complication. And my biggest worry is the growth of the amount of poor in Africa at the moment. I was very, very happy to see a former or colleague from Ivory Coast. I had a great pleasure of working in the Ivory Coast between 2011 and 2013. You see that a similar issue. We should talk, by the way, on the elections. I'm very happy that came into the discussion, because under the conditions of COVID, it is true that elections will be very difficult in the coming weeks and months. And also, I have concerns about the process in the Ivory Coast. But going back to the economy, we can come back to this. I see real GDP levels per capita drop to 2007 levels. That is our estimation. And if you talk per capita, it doesn't say much about the poor. And as we have a lot of inequality in Europe, you see the same in Africa. In the region that I know best, West Africa, although it's home to 6 of the 10 fastest growing African economies, it has the greatest number of people that live below the poverty line. It's more than 30%. And the top 1% of West Africans own more than everyone else combined in the region. So we see inequality between nations and inside nations. And I'm afraid that COVID and the figures that we see right now, and for time reasons, I won't go to all the projections, but I see that that is going to be a major issue, which will not only have consequences in terms of health, education, the role of women, but also future economic opportunities. But also already immediate results and consequences, which I see especially around conflict and around food. And I think everybody who follows the news sees these risks for international food markets because of the logistical constraints. And I see also that some of the real needs that are in Africa immediately, first things first, are around food production, logistics, and reaching the poor with less purchasing power. There's much to be said about it, but let me say that maybe there are a few things that I would just mention in terms of priorities for Europe and for all of us Africans and Europeans alike in that context of inequality within nations and between nations. First things first is the vaccine. I'm very happy that Europe is working on that. The European Union is working on that. My own organization now is also putting, I think, $12 billion to make sure the vaccine will be accessible to all, but I'm not optimistic yet. I think, this is typically something of the weakest link, is a public international good. So I'm worried about that. I think much more should be done. As Joseph Borrell was talking about the lack of multilateralism, here's a fight for who gets injected first. Talking about inequality. The second is, I won't repeat that, but I agree very much what has been said on debt relief. Debt relief means that you pay money back to your creditors at the moment that you should pay it now on health, education, conflict reduction. And therefore, I think today we have the meeting of the G20 in Washington, when there is the annual meeting. I'm afraid it's too shallow. It's only till the end for the next 6 months. And it doesn't involve, so far as I can see, but the decisions are being made today, hedge funds and private creditors. And as you know, also China is now the biggest debtor or creditor to Africa. Also, that's important, as we see, for instance, in the example of Zambia, that pressure is on all creditors to make sure this debt relief is there. Otherwise, we go to something that we had 20 years ago. And I had hoped that we could have overcome that crisis. Thirdly, the funding of the World Food Programme, for the reasons I mentioned. This is all first things first. But the key is, of course, in a moment of globalization, as they call it nicely, that the interests of Europe and Africa are correspondent also in the economy. And it requires, I think, for us in Europe, looking again at our trade relationships, of course, with the EPAs and the follow-up to that, everything but arms. It requires also asset recovery and really working with our banks, because if you talk about inequality in Africa and between Africa and Europe, it's always two sides. And asset recovery, tax policy play a major role in the coherence that we have agreed upon between the European Union and Africa, and by the way, in many of the international agreements in the context of the United Nations. Last 2 points, not to take too much time, is on the flow of capital to Africa. Unfortunately, this is again going to be an issue because of all the predictions that we see for COVID and the consequences. And there's a lot of insecurity there. Let's be open about that. It's not preordained. And you see in different countries that the leadership and the cooperation with others works out in different ways. But if I see the reduction of remittances, the issue of commodity markets, and how this works out in different countries, for me, it's very clear that with the figures we see right now, we see a very high risk for the economic reconstruction and recovery in in Africa. And my two emphases would be, if you want to reduce inequality, work on jobs, agricultural transformation, digital, electricity, all these kind of things that can be done. Make your efforts on fragile states, because there the poverty is still the biggest. And I think we need to do much more in thinking through how that works, although we have thought that we knew how to do that in Africa, but still, as you see, in some of the countries that my predecessor or the speaker before me was speaking about, that's still very necessary. And last but not least, in the whole area of foreign policy and conflict, it's very difficult to say how this would work out. COVID in conflict. But with an economic crisis, that's for sure, an increasing poverty and an enormous emancipation of a young generation of women, like we've seen in Sudan, it's really important how we can work together for those who do not want to stay ready to just support what they see around them, but want a new wave of cooperation within Africa and between Africa and the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koenders. You are also staying with us for the Q&A session. Also joining us this afternoon is Ms. Ruka Sanusi. She's the Executive Director of the Ghana Climate Innovation Center. Good afternoon, Ms. Sanusi.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes. Good afternoon.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon,
Ms. Sanusi, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Sanusi, what is your assessment of the connection between climate and inequality? And in what way is it possible to pursue sustainable and inclusive growth at the same time?
First of all, let me just start by sending my personal thanks to the organizers of this convening for inviting me and my organization, the Ghana Climate Innovation Center, to contribute to the discussion this afternoon. You asked about the connections, climate change, and with maybe the inequalities and all of that. My contribution is actually going to be brief, but I hope it will challenge or enable participants to consider the socio-political and economic inequalities from a perspective that they may not have considered it before. And that viewpoint is from the viewpoint of small and growing businesses, and especially SMEs who have climate innovation, entrepreneurs who are spearheading the transition to a low carbon economy. If I just use the example of Ghana, SMEs actually represent 85% of the business sector. And they contribute significantly to Ghana's GDP. I can hear it echoes, that's why I'm pausing. Is there a problem with the audio?
Miss Sanusi, we can't hear you really well. There is some crack on the line.
That's very unfortunate. I can hear you crystal clear. I'm not sure why that is.
Go
Should
ahead.
I continue or okay? Yes, so I was just saying that in Ghana, SMEs represent 85% of business activity. And within the context of inequalities, socioeconomically, when you consider the real influences of business activity in the private sector, SMEs are not usually top of mind, right? And, you know, that is inequality right there, because top of mind are normally big businesses, large national or global corporations, or well-connected and influential family businesses. Now, and why is there this inequality? Is because small and growing business sector, though they contribute significantly to our GDP, they're individually very small-scale enterprises. They generate minimal revenues and employ a small number of people. So it's easier for the bigger businesses whose billboards we see on our highways and whose adverts we see here on our TVs and radios to be top of mind.
I have to interrupt you again. Could you please turn on your camera on, if that's possible?
My camera is actually on.
Okay.
So I'm not sure what the problem is. It may be a bandwidth problem.
Can I just suggest one thing? I think we're going to try to get you connected again. Meanwhile, I will switch to the next guest speaker and come back to you. Can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon, Mr. Stanishev. Welcome to this session. Mr. Stanishev is the president of the Party of European Socialists. In your opinion, what are some of the priorities that the political family of European Socialists should pursue in order to address inequalities?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having the opportunity to join this debate with very interesting speakers. And I would like to salute also the S&D group for the initiative, which is already a tradition. I think it's 4th or 5th year in a row when we have this Africa Week as an excellent platform where progressives from the European Union and from the African continent can discuss our policies, our strategy about Africa, listen to each other, and elaborate next steps which are needed. Well, my biggest concern of what is happening now regarding to the COVID crisis and its consequences is the very rapid increase of inequalities, both in our societies, in every society, and between the countries. Because this crisis sharpened and brought the inequalities to new highs, which we hope to have behind us. And we see that hunger is regaining strength and positions, and healthcare is also under very severe attack by the COVID, and the health systems are very vulnerable, both in the European Union and I guess to a higher level in Africa. And this is something which is very worrying. This is why we need to work together to overcome the health consequences, but also the economic and the social consequences of the COVID crisis. Here in Europe, since March, our socialist family really focused all the efforts to provide a very powerful and timely response. And back in July, with a very substantial role of the socialist family, the Council adopted a recovery plan, Next Generation EU, which is a powerful tool and which goes in line with our major social priorities, including fighting inequalities and the effort to protect the jobs and the incomes of our citizens. But we have to understand that it's not just a European matter. And today, Africa needs a strong solidarity gestures and actions on behalf of the European Union to support it in the fight with the health crisis and also to support the economic recovery for the continent. Because if you look at the health side of the problem, then probably due to the younger population in Africa, the crisis will have less impact. But the social and economic impact in Africa might be even worse. And we have to be very aware of this and take actions in time. Because there are economists and prognosis that maybe half of the current jobs in Africa are under the corona crisis may be lost. And this is a very substantial threat and a source of inequality and source of troubles, not only economic, but human and political troubles for the whole of the continent. And I think that it is clear, and Josep Borrell already mentioned some of the directions in which we have to work as a union. The first element is debt relief and debt cancellation, because it's of vital importance now for the countries in Africa to have fresh money in order to be able to tackle the health crisis and the economic consequences. Secondly, we need to substantially increase our aid budgets and humanitarian support for Africa, including through the World Food Organization program, because this is extremely important, especially for the poorer parts of the population in Africa and for the poorest countries in Africa. And the European Union has to show that it is able to be adequate and to act in time. And third, we really need a new sustainable investment for Africa, which will provide new jobs, sustainable development based on new economies and new possibilities, for which Africa is rich as a continent. And I think that Borrell already mentioned that we hope that next year will be really the year of Africa for the European Union. And the forthcoming EU-Africa summit should put a solid foundation. Already in the previous years, we, the progressives in Europe, were pressing a lot with some substantial successes, but we need a much broader strategy from now on. Of course, it has first to focus on the first priorities, the fast actions, but also have a stronger long-term impact on the African continent and elaborate it together in dialogue with the African states. I think we are on this right path, but a lot has to be done. This is why I'm so happy to have the chance today also to listen to many interesting speakers and to also absorb new ideas. But you can be assured that us as progressives in the European Union will press on the Union, on the Council especially, to have a very clear strategy, and this strategy to be based on progressive priorities, which is fighting inequality at the first place. Second, providing new opportunities for jobs in Africa through sustainable investment on behalf of the European Union. Then, of course, developing the possibilities of green and sustainable development for the African continent with a substantial role of the European Union to play. And we shall be active in turning these intentions into hopefully a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanchez, and you're also staying for the Q&A. We are going to try to reconnect Ms. Sanusi, who earlier on was experiencing some technical problems. Ms. Sanusi, are you back online? Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Is it possible to also switch on your camera?
I've tried, but I think I actually have bandwidth problems. So I'm sorry about this. Perhaps we could just try with the Q&A because the video is just not working.
Okay, we will do that. Thank you for being understanding.
All right.
As mentioned earlier on today, we have some youth representative joining us online who are going to ask questions to you, distinguished panel guest speakers. So I assume you are all still connected. The first youth representative I'm going to introduce is Pauline Torhau, former political counselor, EU delegation to Nigeria. Are you there? Ms. Torhau, are you connected?
Yes, I am. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
I have
Yes. So you
a
have
lot of chats
questions.
on the line here.
Can
Yes.
you hear
Can you
us?
hear me clearly?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know how young I am. I'm glad you addressed me as a youth representative. But yes, I would like to address a subject matter that is weighs in a lot on when it comes to diminishing inequality, and that is education. In this context, I would like to briefly mention 3 points. First, the World Bank report of 2018, which showed that education has enormous benefits, but that we're also in a learning crisis. And access has improved to education a lot, but the students come out of school lacking fundamental skills like reading and mathematics, and that's the status of education today. In a recent study paper from Harvard and the Global Development Center for Global Development, it says that students from wealthy countries much better exam results, but not only because they come from richer countries, but also because their parents are wealthier. And increased levels of parental income increases the results. And this makes the disadvantages for students from poorer countries even more clear. Thirdly, the access to higher quality education in Africa is limited due to limited resources. The universities have poor international ranking because mainly because of limited resources, thereby not being able to provide higher academic education. So these are enormous challenges. Education is fundamental to economic growth. And I would very much like to ask our panelists how we can make a real change. How do we tackle these? Is this a doomed issue? Or can we actually do something about this? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Torhau. And you are targeting who especially for this question?
Well, maybe the representative of the World Bank would be relevant in this, since he actually comes from the institution that presented the 2018 report. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is for you, Mr. Koenders. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Unfortunately, I didn't hear the question at all. I apologize. I tried to follow, but my connection was very bad. So I unfortunately cannot answer a question I didn't hear. I apologize.
I think Ms. Torhau was. It's true. The connection was not bad on your side. I think it's more on her side.
Okay.
But she was. I think her question is around how to target challenges for access to good education for young people mainly in foreign countries. She highlighted the difficulties of having students to have access to education during this pandemic. I think that's, in a nutshell, what I just tried to summarize from what she was trying to ask to you.
If I may, I was quoting the World Bank report from 2018 as well, which says that there is a learning crisis.
Yes. Look, I'm not formally talking here on behalf of the World Bank, but I think absolutely. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you, Madam. I apologize. But yes, I think that the two priorities right now. One is the enormous risk to all the children in school in Africa at the moment who are in deficient systems because of the COVID crisis. I think that's pretty serious at the moment, if not the most important priority right now. The second is, I think, on issues around Europe and Africa and students. Yeah, my sense is that we have to go to a much more intelligent policy there than we have right now. I believe very much, when I was myself Minister for International Cooperation for my country, but this is quite some time ago, we tried many different elements, but they get much less support right now in terms of circular migration, about possibilities for students to stay and work for some time in Europe and then maybe go back. All kind of different legal pathways to do this. I see also that some of the programs for exchanges of students have been reduced. And I think even that some of the programs on university cooperation, although they have become more important than before, remain very limited. So to the extent that I don't feel like the best expert of this right now, frankly, but I think these two things are absolute priority: a lost generation in education, in the refugee camps, but also in some of the schools because of the lack of funds, as well as a more modern type of exchange between Europe and Africa on student exchange and circular migration.
Thank you, Mr. Koenders. Thank you, Mr. Hall. I will now switch to our next respondent, Hyacinthe Mesmin Pameswa, youth activist from Bangui, Central African Republic. Good afternoon. Are you connected? Now, I do not get any signal. I will try to switch to the next respondent, Laure Deltilia, President of Socialist Youth Brussels.
Voilà, merci de me donner la parole. J'espère que vous m'entendez.
Très bien.
D'accord.
Mais nous ne vous voyons pas.
Je suis revenue d'Afrique de l'Ouest il y a peu de temps et j'ai pu constater qu'il y avait peu d'adhésion des populations aux mesures prises pour lutter contre la propagation du virus. La phrase qui revient assez régulièrement, c'est qu'on préfère prendre le risque de mourir du Covid-19 plutôt que d'être sûr de mourir de faim. Donc, ce qu'on voit, c'est que les mesures qui sont prises, elles sont parfois peu adaptées et bien sûr, elles découlent d'un arbitrage politique. Ma question était de savoir comment est-ce qu'on peut envisager d'encourager les États, donc avec les moyens qu'ils ont à leur disposition, notamment à travers l'aide internationale, de favoriser des mesures qui soient destinées aux populations qui sont réellement les plus précarisées, celles qui vivent au jour le jour, notamment celles qui sont issues des zones rurales ou du secteur informel.
Merci, Madame Deltilia. Et vous adressez votre question particulièrement à qui?
Celui qui voudra bien répondre, mais je pense que Nathalie Yam était dans le sujet, en tout cas. Ouais.
D'accord. Alors, Madame Yam.
Oui.
Oui. Voilà. Vous voulez bien répondre à la question, s'il vous plaît?
Oui, très volontiers. Merci pour la question, Laure. Alors, comment est-ce que l'on peut encourager les États à vraiment utiliser l'aide pour améliorer le quotidien des populations qui en ont besoin? Je pense que ma réponse à ça va être un peu iconoclaste, mais je ne pense pas que ce soit le rôle de l'Union européenne de se substituer au travail que les gouvernements africains devaient faire. Et je pense que lorsque la construction européenne a eu lieu, il y a bien longtemps de cela. Vous avez réussi là-bas en Europe à mettre en place des mécanismes pour dire que ceux qui veulent adhérer à l'Union européenne, ceux qui veulent entrer dans l'Union européenne ont besoin d'avoir un certain standard en termes d'état de droit, de justice, de respect des droits humains, etc. Et malheureusement, dès lors qu'il s'agit de coopération internationale, d'aide internationale, l'Union européenne n'est plus aussi regardante avec qui elle commerce, avec qui à qui elle envoie de l'argent des citoyens européens. Et j'ai écouté tous les intervenants les uns après les autres et je suis très au courant des problèmes d'Afrique, puisque bon, j'y suis confrontée très souvent, mais je ne pense pas que ce soit aux autres de venir nous aider. C'est à nous de faire. Notre problème, ce n'est pas qu'on ne sait pas ce qu'on doit faire. Notre problème, c'est que les gens qui ont la volonté de changer ce système, de mettre l'emphase sur les investissements dans le capital humain, dans l'école, dans la santé, dans la digitalisation, dans l'accès à l'électricité, parce que la dame d'avant parlait des étudiants, etc. C'est vrai que depuis que vous avez fermé les frontières, c'est un peu difficile pour les étudiants d'aller et de venir, mais si on avait sur place des universités qui forment bien, qui donnent des formations de qualité, bon, on se dirait, c'est pas trop grave, on va s'inscrire à l'université d'Abidjan ou bien de Yaoundé au lieu d'aller à Nantes ou à Charleroi. Mais on n'a pas ça, donc on est pris dans une trappe. Je pense que ce que nous attendons, ce que vous devriez peut-être prendre en compte dans la réflexion avec l'Afrique et non pour l'Afrique, c'est de comprendre que ce que nous attendons de vous, c'est peut-être un soutien pour, non pas pour nous aider, nous les populations, mais pour renforcer le pilier démocratique sur lequel l'Europe est construite. Si nous avons des mécanismes démocratiques, si les jeunes dont on parle ont l'impression ou savent qu'ils ne sont pas exclus de la liste électorale, du choix des dirigeants, du projet qu'ils veulent avoir pour la Côte d'Ivoire, de la façon dont ils veulent être gouvernés, s'ils peuvent prendre part à ce processus démocratique sans avoir l'impression que quoi qu'ils disent, c'est déjà joué d'avance et que s'ils ne sont pas d'accord, ils vont finir en prison, s'ils ont l'impression qu'ils ont encore de l'espoir, de l'avenir dans leur propre pays, alors tout ira bien. Les premiers investissements qu'on doit faire, Laure, ce n'est pas dans les routes, ce n'est pas dans les ponts, c'est dans le capital humain. Et ça, les Africains le savent. Il y a des Africains qui le savent. Malheureusement, ceux qui nous gouvernent ne trouvent pas d'intérêt à cela parce que les populations nécessiteuses leur donnent l'impression d'être des grands mécènes et l'aide que vous envoyez, parfois de façon sincère, est systématiquement détournée, systématiquement n'atteint pas ses cibles, employée à des projets qui n'aident pas les populations à sortir de la pauvreté. Je pense que c'est ça. Le truc, c'est de savoir écouter ce genre de message que nous portons, qui ne plaît pas toujours, parce que c'est vrai que vous pensez, vous parlez, vous êtes en avance sur nous, vous avez des problèmes de climat, le climate change, etc. Nous, c'est comment on va manger au moins une fois par jour. Vous voyez, on n'a pas les mêmes problèmes, on n'a pas les mêmes priorités. Et c'est vrai qu'on peut faire un bond en avant, on n'est pas obligé de passer par toutes les étapes que vous avez faites, mais la base, c'est d'avoir une société bien formée, une société qui vit dans la paix, qui n'est pas affamée du matin au soir. Donc, je pense que c'est ça. C'est de cette façon-là qu'on peut aider. C'est pas nécessairement en venant construire des écoles, en venant construire des toilettes, en venant offrir des sacs de riz que ça va changer le système dans lequel on est. Mais en conditionnant peut-être l'aide que vous donnez à des mécanismes démocratiques, en conditionnant cela à l'ouverture, à la liberté qui vous caractérise là-bas en Europe, alors là, ça nous permettrait à nous d'avancer. Mais on n'a pas besoin vraiment d'être infantilisé, on a besoin de pouvoir se prendre en main et de savoir que de par le monde, il y a des peuples, il y a des jeunes qui savent ce que nous traversons et qui poussent la machine chez eux là-bas pour que les gouvernements changent leur façon de collaborer avec l'Afrique.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Yamb. Pour rester dans cette thématique, tous les intervenants jusqu'ici ont parlé, n'est-ce pas, de ce partenariat Afrique-Europe, des perspectives, comment continuer dans cette collaboration. On a aussi parlé des financements qui sont apportés par des organisations internationales et différents partenaires internationaux. Et une question vient du public, et je vais la lire en anglais. How do we ensure that financial support sent by international donors reaches the actual people? Alors, comment s'assurer que les financements, le soutien financier apporté par les différents institutions internationales et bailleurs de fonds atteignent les populations qui en ont besoin? And this is also a question addressed to all the panel guest speakers. Je vais commencer par vous, Madame Yamb.
Je ne sais pas si je peux donner mon avis et puis le temps que
Oui.
les autres se connectent.
Tout à fait.
Mais ce n'est pas par hasard si aujourd'hui, le levier de sortie de la pauvreté le plus important qu'il y a en Afrique, avant l'aide publique au développement, avant les investissements directs étrangers, c'est les transferts des migrants. C'est l'argent que Bouba, qui est parti travailler à Bruxelles là-bas, envoie chaque mois à travers Western Union, MoneyGram ou d'autres chemins, qu'il envoie à sa famille, parce que c'est le seul argent qui arrive effectivement à son destinataire. Si j'envoie de l'argent à ma famille pour scolariser mes petits frères, quand c'est Bouba qui envoie, c'est maman qui va chercher ça chez Western Union et elle utilise cet argent pour ça. Donc, c'est pas par hasard que la migration demeure le principal levier de sortie de la pauvreté en Afrique. Maintenant, comment changer cela? Je pense que ça vient de nos systèmes de gouvernement. Nous n'avons malheureusement pas des systèmes de gouvernement, des institutions qui nous permettent de contrôler les hommes politiques, de leur demander de rendre compte. Ici, le président, c'est un mélange du pape, d'un roi, d'un président, de Trump. Il est hyper, méga, ultra puissant. Personne n'ose lui demander quoi que ce soit. C'est lui qui décide, c'est lui qui, quand il n'a pas envie de faire quelque chose, il bypasse l'Assemblée nationale, il gouverne par ordonnance. Demander des comptes à quelqu'un ici équivaut soit à entrer en prison, soit à se faire expulser, soit à se faire tabasser. Donc, c'est ce système de gouvernement qu'il faut changer pour, d'une part, mettre en place des institutions fortes et puis, d'autre part, éduquer les populations pour qu'elles comprennent que le souverain, c'est elle, c'est le citoyen, c'est pas le dirigeant. Lorsqu'on aura un système dans lequel les populations exigeront et obtiendront des comptes des gouvernants, alors ce sera beaucoup plus difficile pour l'aide d'être détournée. Lorsqu'on aura une justice indépendante, transparente, qui condamne, qui sanctionne les détournements, même quand ils sont commis au plus haut sommet de l'État, on aura moins de détournements. Et puis, il faut bien se dire que s'il y a moins de détournements, si l'argent arrive effectivement là où il faut aller, alors la résultante à la fin, c'est qu'on aura peut-être plus du tout recours ou très peu recours au financement extérieur, à la dette extérieure, et que les personnes, l'Afrique se sera développée et aura atteint le niveau où elle devrait être aujourd'hui, normalement, s'il n'y avait pas tous ces brigands qui nous gouvernent.
Merci, Madame Yamb. Anyone else from the panel would like to take this question? How do we ensure that the financial support sent or given by international donors reach the actual people? Yes. Mr.
Yes,
Cruz.
thank you very much. Look, I mostly agree what has been said by the previous speaker from Abidjan. It's, by the way, one of the most difficult questions. I think it's first of all, as she said, I think it's important, the real development never comes from aid. Aid can only be a catalyst, and it can be a negative or a positive catalyst, depending on how it's given, to whom, under what conditionality, and what is the ownership of the country itself. As Europe is not one nation, and we have differences even on support in Europe, even now on the rule of law in Hungary and other places. Of course, Africa is also not one country. I happen to know the country of the previous speaker pretty well as former special representative of the United Nations there just after the elections in 2011. And I know how difficult it is to do this in the right way. In some countries, sanctions may unfortunately work, but it's externally imposed. It's not necessarily very democratic, but you can say in some countries where there is an enormous corrupt elite that takes away the money from the people, it makes no sense to support that with large funds of money. Doesn't mean there are no possibilities to reach the population. When it comes to humanitarian aid, it has to be impartial and neutral, and is, in my view, always important. I think it worked very well in parts of the Ivory Coast as well. The key comes from trade, investment, remittances, and other areas. And I think the biggest role for the European Union is to have coherence in its policy towards trade, to make sure that there is also the possibility of transformation of products. In Ivory Coast, that's obviously through coffee and cocoa, but should be on many more areas. And it should not be just, imported from there, but there should be the possibility also to have what we call for trade, which might be very useful. I think the work on SMEs that we do in the World Bank with the International Finance Corporation, leading also to investments that create directly jobs in disadvantaged regions, helps also to emancipate people and give them a voice. So it's a difficult question. It's in each country different. I think the goal should always be how to reach the poor and be a catalyst for real development. And it's always the ownership of the people themselves. And make this a serious concern in all the efforts that you have. And sometimes that's first things first. I think whatever government you have, in an emergency like COVID, it is important that there is big support quickly on health systems and these kind of things. But obviously, like we did before with debt reduction and the so-called poverty reduction strategy papers, this is always, for whom is the benefit. And aid dependency is never a good thing, should always be reduced, but in a way that helps countries to become stronger in their own position in the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koenders. Another question coming in from the live feed. What could we as Europeans do to strengthen democracy and peace? And I would like to encourage Mr. Stanishev also to respond. Maybe that's a good question for you.
Well, I'm looking forward with the EU-Africa Summit. As you heard, Josep Borrell mentioned that especially the progressive commissioners who are responsible for this task are working very hard and hope there will be deliveries. Actually, Europe has always been a soft power. It is not a great military power as the United States or NATO or any other, but its strength is in economic cooperation. Its strength is in securing peace and another attitude. And I think that apart from everything else, we have also our homework to do. Because in order to be useful for Africa, we have to accomplish our domestic tasks, starting with the multi-annual financial framework, which is the budget of the European Union, which is now under discussion. And it was in general approved by the European Council in July, but there are still important elements to discuss between the Council, the European Parliament, and the European Commission, including the issue of rule of law, including some lines in the budget which are important from a policy point of view. And I think it is really vital that we adopt our MFF finally by the end of this year in order to be able to have the financial tools to support Africa first on the COVID emergency and then develop a more strategic cooperation. And I think there is a ground to put some conditionalities on the cooperations between the European Union and Africa, including in different forms of economic cooperation, as it is a case of discussing internally in the Union itself at the moment. Because let's be frank, we are also far from perfect. Even if you look at the issues of democracy and rule of law, now there is this debate in the European Union that we need conditionality in order to protect that the money are going to the population and are not used by authoritarian leaders inside the European Union. That means that if we are successful in implementing it finally in the European Union, I see no obstacles that such conditionality is put in our relations with African governments. It makes sense, and it should be subdued to the interests of developing civil society, democratic processes in every African country. But we also, in order to be on a strong side in this process, to have the means, including the financial means, which is an incentive for progressive reforms also in many African countries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sanchev. Maybe Mr. Saruwaka, any insights or advice or suggestions that you would like to share on how Europe, what Europe can do to strengthen democracy and peace?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Can you switch on your camera, please?
Yes, it's on. On.
Yes, we can see you.
Yeah, for sure. There is a lot Europe can do to help Africa play by the rules of democracy. It's very unfortunate that a lot of abuse of the democratic space in Africa is allowed to go on without any punishment to the perpetrators. I speak from the background of being an opposition member in Zimbabwe, where every other rule is probably broken by the regime. And we don't always see the international community frowning upon the behavior of the leadership. It appear sometime back before 2000 or so, there was a lot of effort in trying to speak against rogue governments or leaders that break the rules. But over time, it would appear Europe is now afraid of a backlash, of being accused of advancing maybe colonial interests. We have moved away from colonialism. We're setting up a new partnership with Africa. So my first advice is Europe must not be worried about leaders in Africa who want to raise the race card when it comes to when they are being asked to play by the rules. Rules are rules and they must be respected. So one thing is Europe must not bend its rules to accommodate those that break them. By doing that, I am very positive that will set a very good example. Because I can tell you, I cannot miss this opportunity to talk about the atrocities that are happening in Zimbabwe, where journalists who speak against the excesses of the state are arrested randomly, where opposition members of parliament are arrested, abducted, abused, and sent to jail. And so for the people of Africa, from countries where their oppressors is seats of power, we really need that support from Europe, where rules are broken, then people must pay for it. So for me, it's simple. People must just play by the rules. Europe must not bend its standards to accommodate rogue elements in government. Let's just set high standards, just like we have in Europe for Africa. Because for me, a citizen in Zimbabwe, in Ivory Coast, in Ghana, must enjoy the same rights and freedoms, just like a citizen in Sweden and in any other part of Europe. So our standards for democracy must not be lower for Africa. Let's demand best, even in our relationships. That's my contribution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saruwaka. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this high-level political panel. I would like to thank all the speakers for their contribution to making this panel possible. Thank you for your time to all speakers, and thank you for the audience that has been following us. And I would like to invite this audience to stay online as the program continues. At 6, there will be a feminist cultural cafe called The Power of African Feminist Art. Please stay online, and I'm sure that other part of the program will be very interesting, just like this session we just had. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Merci.